All right, there we go. All right, so last time we talked about protists, and we said that a lot of scientists think that they were the first eukaryotes. And they think that they came to be from prokaryotes, that they were ancestors of prokaryotes. And we've talked bunches of times in here already about the endosymbiotic hypothesis. How that's supposed to explain organelles, lines, which ones. Mitochondria, chloroplast, flagella. But we said that there are other organelles like, say, ER, that this doesn't really explain, because those things never could have been separate living things. What's that other idea for how some of the more bag-like organelles came to be? Membrane invagination, yep. Also remember that the protists today really aren't considered a taxonomic group anymore, because taxonomy, we've talked about it bunches of times in here today, is based on phylogenetics. How are things related through genetics and evolution? And as they started studying protists more, they're not really very related. So where they go in the classification system is sort of up for grabs. A lot of things that we used to call algae are now classified as plants. And then the things that we called protozoans, they're just sort of out there on their own right now. They don't really belong to a kingdom in most cases. Remember though that the algae are the plant-like protists, the protozoans are the animal-like one. They're kind of all over the place in terms of their characteristics. Most of them are single-celled, not all. All of them are eukaryotic. That's the one thing they do have in common. They can be autotrophic or heterotrophic. Something that it doesn't say up here, that some have a wall, some don't. So they're varied. We talked about the different groups a little bit last time. How that the protozoans are classified based on how they move, their method of locomotion. And typically they do not have a wall. And how that the algae are classified based on the pigments, the light-absorbing pigments that they have inside them. We talked too about blooms, how that algae can grow out of control, usually when there's too much of which nutrients in the water? Phosphorus and nitrogen. And usually they got there because of something that we did accidentally, right? Whether it was fertilizing a field nearby, or spilling something into the water, or maybe a sewage leak, something like that, puts those nutrients in the water. Also remember that algae make up part of phytoplankton, which is the plant-like stuff, phyto, that floats on the water, plankton. And that's a big part of the food chain. We looked at this phylogenetic tree, and how that what it's supposed to show you is that all the eukaryotes started back here. My pen is still not wanting to work for me. What's that purple spot supposed to be? Those are the protists. Protists are supposed to be the ancestors of all the rest of them. That picture apparently was a link, so let's go back off that. So we talked about our different groups of protozoans a little bit. We mentioned Mystigophora. Those are the ones with flagella. We talked several times about these contractile vacuoles. They're freshwater animals. What's a constant problem for freshwater organisms? Water doing what? Going in. So to keep from exploding, these vacuoles collect the water, spray it back out, and pump it out, essentially. We talked about Giardia, which is an organism that you can get from where? Fresh water. Okay, that's not really fresh. Okay, looks fresh, but not necessarily like streams and stuff. Can cause really bad diarrhea. We talked about trypanosomes, which cause an infection you can get from where? These are ones in Africa you get from insect bites called tsetse flies. And what do they cause? Sleeping sickness. They make you go into a coma, essentially, that you may not ever wake up from. They essentially start feeding on your brain. Not a pretty picture. We talked about the ciliates, or ciliata. Main example of this being the paramecium. If they use those little cilia to move, they also use them to sweep food into their mouth. like the others, they have the contractile vacuoles to get rid of water. And sort of like bacteria, they can attach together, conjugate, and switch what? What do they switch? Yeah, DNA. They don't have plasmids, but they have an extra nucleus. They have a big nucleus, macronucleus, and small nucleus, a micronucleus, and they can swap the small one to get some variation. Sarcodina, we talked a lot about. Those are the ones with pseudoploids. Main example being the amoeba. Usually feed by phagocytosis. They have contractile vacuoles too. Remember that a lot of things in this group make shells around themselves. The foraminiferans make a shell out of CaCO3. What's CaCO3? What's this chemical name? Calcium carbonate, but it's also known as limestone. That's where a lot of our limestone comes from. And then the radiolarans make a shell out of silica, which we said is essentially what? Glass. Kind of cool. They're really cool looking organisms. Remember that the things in class Sarcodina can cause some human diseases like dysentery, which is another bad case of diarrhea. There's also the brain-eating amoeba, which is sort of scary as well. The last group of protists we'll mention are the sporozoans. These are thought to be the most advanced, even though they can't move on their own, because they've co-evolved. They've evolved with something else to be what? They're parasites. And usually they have more than one host. Usually there's one host that they live in that they don't hurt. And what do they use that host for? The one that they don't hurt, what do they use that host for? Yeah, that's transport, like mosquitoes or some kind of bug. And then the other hosts, those are the ones they actually parasitize on and they feed on and they hurt and they damage. By far the most famous one of these is a guy named Plasmodium, and that's the organism that causes what really bad disease? Malaria. I think we might have mentioned toxoplasma too. We said one of the strange places you can get that from is where? Cats, especially their litter boxes. And it's really a dangerous thing for a pregnant woman to get. It can cause like spontaneous abortion kinds of stuff. Pregnant women are supposed to avoid cats. Seriously, not joking. Yeah. Not knowing what's going to be right now. All right, we talked too a little bit about algae and how that you've got the golden algae in a group called Chrysopida. These things, the most famous one are the diatoms. And these have really crazy looking silica shells, glass shells essentially. They are probably the most important producers in the ocean. They do more photosynthesis than anything else. Really, really important part of the food chain. I also mentioned that their shells, we use them for what? We use a little glass shell, glass-like shells of these things for. Crunchy stuff in toothpaste. These things. The stuff on sandpaper. These things. Stuff on an emery board like you do your fingernails with. These things. We use them for abrasives. So they're pretty important. And the little pieces of glass-like stuff you see in the sand, most of that, shells of these things. So they're everywhere. We talked about pyrophyta, which literally means fiery plants, right? Not plants, they're algae, but they're close. They're also part of the food chain. One of the cool things about them, the reason they're called fiery plants is because they can do bioluminescence. They can make their own light, sort of like a jellyfish. The most famous one of these is the dinoflagellate, which causes the red tides. It's an algal bloom. Remember, it's poisonous, and it's a good example of this biological magnification. What's that? Biological magnification. Important concept. Yeah, it's when poisons do what as you go up the food chain? Build up. Because most of the time, they're poisons that are soluble in what? fat. And once you take something in that's fat soluble, it stays in you. And if you eat a lot of things that just have a little bit of poison, you end up with a lot of poison, right? Because you eat all those little things that didn't have much poison each. So usually things that get affected the most by poisons are things up at the top of the food chain, because the amount of poison in each one of those things goes up as you go up the chain. We talked about euglenas in here several times. That's the last group. These are the ones that are sort of like plant, meat, animal. They can do photosynthesis, but they can also eat, and they can move. They have flagella. We looked at some pictures last time. We'll put them back up. I think we ran out of time in one session last week. This thing over here on the left, this is our diatom. This is the one with the glass-like shell. Over here is the dinoflagellates. This is the one that causes the red tide. There's a euglena. Again, it's nice and green. It can do photosynthesis, but it has a little eye spot, which isn't really an eye. It's more like a what? A light detector, and that tells it to move toward the light so it can do photosynthesis. There's an amoeba, and these little extensions of the amoeba, what are those? Those are pseudopods, and it sort of just flows toward those. That's how it moves. That's the foraminifera. Remember, those are the ones with limestone shells. That's the radiolarian with a glassy-like shell. Here's a paramecium. It's one of the ciliates. And you can see all the little cilia that help it move and eat. Here you see its two nuclei, micro and macro. And the little contractile vacuole right here that helps it to pump out water. There you see them conjugating, which is how they get genetic variation. Because normally they reproduce how? All these protists. Mitosis, essentially, right? This is cell division, asexual. That's showing you the plasmodium, the thing that causes malaria, and how it's transmitted from the salivary glands of a mosquito. And those go into your body. They get into your liver where they reproduce, and then they bust out of your liver and they feed on your red blood cells. Not a pretty picture. Now, which sex of the mosquito do you always get diseases from? The females. Because the males reproduce and then die. That's it. That's what mosquitoes do, seriously. Okay, they reproduce and die. Females have to harvest the eggs, they have to take care of the eggs, have to lay the eggs. It takes a while, so they have to feed a few times before they die. And they're the ones that are sucking your blood. All right, this thing right here, we talked about how it's an important protist that lives in the guts of termites. It's called trichonipha. And it's a good thing for the termite, because what does it allow them to do? Digest what chemical in the wood? Cellulose. And without that mutualistic symbiote inside it, it wouldn't be able to eat, at least not wood. This is the scary looking thing that causes the African sleeping sickness. And this is a slide of them in your blood. Kind of scary looking. All right. That's it for protists. Any questions there? All right, we're going to switch over and talk immune system for us for a minute. So we're switching topics completely here. Our next few topics in these study sessions are going to be different systems in your body. There's about 4 systems that you're supposed to learn about in AP biology. One of them is immune, endocrine, nervous, and urinary. Those 4 systems. Not sure why they picked those 4 for you to learn about in this class, but those are the 4 you're supposed to know. Your immune system's kind of cool to learn about. Now, we probably won't get to the cool part today. What we're going to learn about today is what's called the non-specific or innate part of your immune system. Now that word innate shows up a lot in biology. What's innate mean? You might have heard of innate behaviors before. What is innate? No? It means like built in. Almost like instinctual. You're born with it. Built in. And we'll contrast that with the other part of your immune system, which we probably won't get to today. The other part is called the acquired. So that part you have to get, right? This part you're born with. The other part you have to build up over time. So your non-specific or innate immune system protects you from just general bad stuff. There are parts of your immune system, though, that only protect you from specific things, right? That's why you become immune to certain diseases, right? You've had it before, you learned how to fight it off, and now you have a defense against it. That is not what we're talking about right now. We're talking about general defenses. The most important part of your immune system, probably your overall immune system, is your skin. People who get burned real bad, I'm talking like 80-90% of the body. If they die, which they oftentimes will from that bad a burn, what kills them usually? Infection. Yeah, either infection or what? Dehydration. Because that's another important thing your skin does, right? It keeps in the water. So it keeps in the water, keeps out the germs. That's what your skin does for you, mostly. So you might think of your skin as a barrier, almost like a wall around a city or a country. That's kind of what it's about, keeping out invaders. But it's not just a wall. It's an active kind of wall. It makes secretions. So it's not just about blocking the invaders, it's about killing them. Some of those secretions are acidic. Some of the secretions actually have proteins in them that are antibacterial. An example of that is sweat. Sweat is both acidic and it has urea in it. We talked about urea before. What is it? It's the stuff in your urine, which is made from what? Chemical that's really dangerous. What'd you say? Ammonia. Ammonia is toxic. Really, really toxic. Urea is not as toxic, but it's still toxic. So it can kill things that are on your skin. Germs, bacteria. So sweat actually helps you in some cases to fight off germs on your skin. Not to mention that it's got salt in it, which can also help to fight off germs, right? Because what does it do to the germs if it's salty? Pulls the water out of them, dries them out, right? All right, moving on down. I'm going to skip through a couple of these. Let's talk about inflammation for a second. When do you tend to get inflammation? When do parts of your body become inflamed? When they got an infection, or what else? When might you get swelling and redness? A burn, cut, an infection, right? When tissues are damaged, you have cells in those tissues. Most of the time they're called mast cells. And those tissues essentially send out an SOS signal when they're damaged. And those SOS signals, cell signals, the main one of them is called histamine, which you've heard of before, right? Histamine. Where you heard of histamine at before? Heard of antihistamines. Sometimes those mast cells send out false alarms. What do we call those false alarms? What do we call it when your immune system starts sending out a lot of false alarms? Allergies. Okay? That's what allergies are. And one of the things that histamines cause you to do is leak, essentially. swell. And it causes things like your sinuses to swell, the membranes in your sinuses. It causes you to start running, your eyes to run, your nose to run. So we have some medicines, antihistamines, which help to slow that down. But it turns out histamines are normally a good thing. Because once a tissue is damaged, histamine is released. What's it telling your body? What's histamine telling your body to do? If it's working the way it's supposed to. No, not yet. It's telling your body to send more blood to the area that's damaged. Now, at first that sounds like a bad idea. Let's say you got a cut. The mast cells in the area of that cut talk to the blood vessels nearby and essentially tell those blood vessels to send more blood to that cut area. First, that sounds like a really bad idea, right? But why would you want to send more blood to a cut area? One, you send platelets, which are the cells that start plaques. What else do you need to do? There's a hole in your wall. What do you need to send? Your skin is cut. There's a hole in the wall. What do you need to send to the hole? You need to send the cops. Okay? Right? And what are the cops? Those are blood cells. You send them there to round up the things that are busting through the wall. Okay? The germs, the viruses, the fungi, whatever is coming through the wall, you have to catch them. So histamine, again, released by damaged or cells in damaged areas, released by mast cells, and they essentially send more blood to the damaged area, sending more platelets, more white blood cells to get things that might have invaded your body. There's another chemical very similar. I'm not going to talk about it today, called the prostaglandin, but it's a very similar kind of thing. I'm going to skip down and talk about interferon next. That word looks like interfere, right? And it turns out it's called that because it interferes with the lytic cycle. So it's a protein that interferes with the lytic cycle. What's the lytic cycle? It's the virus life cycle, right? That's how viruses reproduce. So it's sort of a protein that your body makes that helps you to fight off virus infections. It interferes with their life cycle. And scientists can now make that chemical outside your body. And it's been used to treat everything from HIV to hepatitis, some other diseases as well, viral diseases. You might not think of stomach acid as a part of your immune system, but it turns out it's a really important part of your immune system. All the things that go in your mouth, most of those things have germs on them of some kind or other. Most of those germs, when they hit your stomach acid, they die. Because what are they mostly made out of? What are most living things mostly made out of other than water? Proteins. What happens to proteins when they hit pH 2? What's the word? They denature, they change shape, they fall apart. They don't work anymore. Now there are some germs that can handle stomach acid. For many, many years, up until maybe the last 20 years, what did doctors think caused ulcers? Let me back up for a minute. What is an ulcer? It's like a hole in your stomach. And it can go deep. So deep that you start bleeding internally, and you can bleed to death, literally, from an ulcer. But when you have an ulcer, your stomach feels upset all the time. You might have a lot of acid reflux, pains in your stomach, gas. It wouldn't be a comfortable situation. What did they think caused them for many, many years? Just until recently. It's not what they used to think. That is what causes them. That's not what they used to think. They thought they were caused from stress. You've all been in situations before you got stressed out or worried about something and you kind of got upset with your stomach. Something got upset. You know what I'm talking about? It can cause you to make more stomach acid. So they thought the problem was too much stomach acid. So how did they treat ulcers? They gave you medicines to lower the amount of stomach acid you were making. You've seen commercials for stuff like Pepsin AC or Zantac, or there's all kinds of medicines that do that. But it took years for people to get over the ulcers. And that was just the way it was. They just thought, hey, we can't really get rid of these things too fast. And then one day, scientists start studying the stomach, and he finds there are these bacteria living in your stomach. And that most ulcers are actually caused by infections. So now how do they treat ulcers? Antibiotics. And they go away within just a few days. Whereas before it was taking years and years and years to get rid of them. So medicine, constantly changing, constantly learning more. But stomach acid is really, really important to protect you against things that come in through the mouth. This next term, normal flora. Normally, when we use the word flora, what are we talking about? Normally you talk about flora and what? Fauna. Flora and fauna, right? The flora are the plants that live in a place. And the fauna are the animals that live in a place, right? Flora and fauna. Almost always use those words together. Here we're not. And we're not talking about plants that normally live inside you. That would be strange, right? What are we talking about here when we talk about your normal flora? What's living in you? That's pretty important. Bacteria. That's what we're talking about. It turns out that in your body right now, in or on it, there are more prokaryotic cells than there are what? Eukaryotic cells. There are more bacterial cells on or in you than there are your own cells. That's kind of strange. What do they do for you that's good in terms of your immune system? Well, they help with digestion, that's true, but that's not so much with the immune system, right? What do they do with your immune system? I want you to think of your normal flora like your offensive line. They block for you. There's so many of those things growing in certain parts of your body that what can't happen? Other things can't grow because there's so many of them. They just crowd them out. They block them out. That's why when you're on antibiotics, what sometimes happens. When you take antibiotics, let's say you have strep throat, are the antibiotics just killing the bacteria that cause strep throat? They're killing the good stuff too, right? What sometimes happens when you kill the good stuff? You get some other infection. For example, a lot of times when women get on antibiotics, what side infection do you ladies sometimes get? That you wouldn't have gotten if you hadn't been on the antibiotics. A lot of times women get yeast infections when they're on antibiotics because the antibiotic kills off the bacteria living in the reproductive system, and now there's room for the yeast to grow, and they do because there's no offensive line there anymore. A lot of times people get diarrhea when they're on antibiotics, and that's because you kill off good bacteria and you let things that shouldn't be growing in there start to grow. All right, I'm going to mention two other things. I've got to go out and be on duty in the front of the library, so let me finish up here. Think about your eyes and your mouth and how rare it is to get an infection in either one of those two places. I mean, we're all poking at our eyes all the time, all kinds of things go in your mouth, and you don't get infections in there very often. One of the main reasons is that in your saliva and in your tears, there are these chemicals called lysozymes. What do we know lyso means? Break down. Okay? So lysozymes, or lysozymes rather, are proteins which essentially kill and break down germs, viruses, bacteria, fungus, and they protect those parts of your body from getting sick, from getting infections. Pretty important. You also have your mucous membranes, which essentially cover every opening into your body, right? Nose, and every opening essentially has some kind of mucous membrane coating. And your mucous membranes do a lot of things for you. Let's say you're living out in Arizona where it's really dry. What's an important thing your mucous membranes do for you when you breathe? They wet the air as it comes in. As we said before, for gases to be able to diffuse, the membranes that they diffuse through have to be thin and what? Wet. So that's one thing your mucous membranes do. They moisten the air as you breathe. If you're living up in Alaska, what's it important that your mucous membranes do as you breathe? Warm up that air. As before it gets into your lungs, you don't want your lungs to freeze, that'd be kind of bad. It warms up the air as you breathe it in. But the main thing we think about with the mucous membranes is that mucus catches the germs. Right? That's like a filter. It's a filtering system. Doesn't necessarily kill the germs, but it catches it, and then that mucus mostly ends up where? Where's most mucus end up? In your stomach. And that's where the killing happens, is in the stomach. All right, the very last thing I'll mention here on the non-specific part of your immune system are pyrogens. Pyrogens. Pyro. What does pyro mean? Fire. These are proteins in your body that cause you to develop a fever. And it turns out a fever usually is a good thing. When you get sick, you get a fever, and you take Advil for your fever, does the Advil treat whatever's making you sick? It just causes your fever to go down, right? What are you actually doing by making your fever go down? You're probably causing yourself to be sick for longer because the fever is part of your immune response. And when that fever is there, your immune system works better. You kill things faster. Bacteria don't like it when your body temperature goes up. They've evolved to live at 98.6. And when your body temperature goes up above that, they don't work as well. Anyway, we'll talk more about that later. For right now, this is the non-specific part of your immune system, protecting you from germs in general. Remember that we sometimes call it innate, which essentially means it's like built in. You're born with it. And I'm going to stop there and go do what I have to do.